Secrets and Sacrifice, Book 4 in the Shadows series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Jessie Sweeney.
Chapters 1 to 10.
Chapter 1. Belfast, 1985. Grace rose, pausing momentarily before marching to the front of the courtroom. The 12 members of the jury sat in their box, looking weary after a week of listening to the despicable deeds of Donald Patrick O'Malley. Now it was up to her to convince them they should find him guilty of murder. A hush fell over the courtroom as Grace cast her gaze over them. She'd prepared for this moment, but would it be enough? Niall would no doubt have a brilliant closing argument. Hers had to dazzle. Grace took a deep breath to steady herself, but just as she opened her mouth to speak, a tall, thin man with darkish hair, shaved on the sides and spiked on top, entered the room, catching her attention. Grace's body stiffened. Caleb? No, it can't be. Or could it? Her brother never came to court, even when she was prosecuting a high-profile case such as this, but it sure looked like him. Grace's heart raced and a feeling of dread flooded her body. He would only come if something bad had happened. Regardless, she'd have to ignore him and focus on the job at hand. Besides, it might not even be him. Returning her attention to the jury, she began her closing arguments, affording herself the occasional glance at the man. It was Caleb, no doubt about it. His face, normally pale, was deathly white. Something bad must have happened. Somehow she focused on her speech. She needed to win. No way could she allow O'Malley to walk free after beating his wife to death. But with Caleb sitting in the back, it was a challenge. Finally, she reached her conclusion. So, members of the jury, after all you've heard, I beg you to find the accused Donald Patrick O'Malley guilty as charged. Thank you. Grace's stomach tightened as her gaze met Caleb's on her short walk back to her seat. She was tempted to go to him, but that would be breaking protocol. She'd have to wait to find out what had happened. Her head hurt. She'd put everything she had into her speech, and now she felt drained. Normally she could relax a little after her job was done, but now, with Caleb sitting behind her, impossible. Brian leaned over and offered his congratulations. Grace gave him a half-smile. Brian, her trusted assistant and most ardent advocate, would always say she'd done well, even if she hadn't. Grace inhaled deeply to settle herself as the judge called for the defendant's closing arguments. Niall stood, and as he walked to the front of the room, she chastised herself for allowing him to unnerve her. Even after a week of seeing him every day, she failed to treat him like any other man. Because he wasn't any other man. He had aged a little. Small flecks of grey peppered the dark hair poking out from under his wig, only serving to increase his appeal. He'd also changed. It wasn't just the suit, or his lean body. There was something else. Grace had seen it from the front of the courtroom where he'd caught her eye on the first day of the trial. A sadness, and no doubt she was partly responsible. But it puzzled her. Surely 3 years in London would have given him enough time to move on. He wasn't quite the same man she'd fallen in love with in the heady days of college. But his nearness still stirred something deep inside her. A tap on her shoulder jolted her, and she looked up into a clerk's concerned eyes. Miss, your brother is asking to see you urgently. Grace spun around. It must be bad. Her stomach churned as she grasped the rail and pulled herself up before making her way, as unobtrusively as possible, to the back of the room. Sliding into the seat, Grace grabbed Caleb's thin arm and leaned close to him. She looked into his troubled eyes. What's happened, Caleb? Come outside, Grace. Caleb took her arm and led her into the foyer as Niall began his closing argument. She shouldn't leave, but this sounded like an emergency. And besides, Brian was more than capable of taking notes. "What's wrong, Caleb? It's not Caitlin, is it? Or the girls?" Grace gripped him tighter. "Please don't tell me it's the girls." Caleb faced her. "If you stop talking, I'll tell you." Grace pulled herself up. He was right. She needed to stop talking. She was jumping to conclusions. Best get the facts. "Okay, who?" Grace's heart beat faster. Was she ready to find out? Caleb gulped, his protruding Adam's apple bobbing in his heavily tattooed neck. "Brianna's been found." Grace's eyes widened and she grabbed his arm again. "Brianna? Where is she? Is she okay?" Caleb paused, holding Grace's gaze. "She can't be." "She's alive, Grace, but only just. She was found this morning unconscious." Grace covered her mouth with her hand. "I thought you were going to say she was dead." She let out a huge sigh. Was it wrong to be relieved when your sister had been found unconscious? Where was she? "In a dingy apartment. Looks like an overdose." "She promised." Grace huffed and narrowed her eyes. "She promised, Caleb. If only she'd kept her word." "It's not that simple, Grace. You know that." Grace sighed heavily. "Yes, I do." "Where is she?" "St. Vincent's. I'm going now. Can you come?" "Not yet, but I will as soon as I can. Have you called the others?" Caleb ran his hand along the side of his shaved head. "No, I only just found out. I came straight here. I'll call them now." Grace pulled a cigarette from under her robe and lit up. She didn't offer one to Caleb. "She'd better pull through." She took several quick puffs. "Yes, she'd better. Caitlin's at home praying. She said that's the best thing she can do to help." Grace rolled her eyes. That's exactly what Caleb's wife, Caitlin, would do. Caleb leaned in and hugged Grace. "Come as soon as you can." Grace hugged him back and held his gaze. "You're a good brother, Caleb." As she watched Caleb hurry off, she took several more quick drags on her cigarette before grinding it out in an ashtray on the windowsill. When she re-entered the courtroom, Niall was towards the end of his speech. Grace remained at the back to avoid creating a disturbance. It was difficult to focus. All she could think of was Brianna, her younger sister, lying in hospital, unconscious. What if she dies? Grace needed to get there as quickly as possible, but what could she do to help? At least Caitlin could pray. Grace couldn't even do that. It didn't matter. Being there would be enough. Grace allowed her gaze to follow Niall as he took his seat. Just the look of him stirred her insides. Why did he come back to Belfast? Surely London would have been more exciting. Moving forward quietly, she slid into her seat beside Brian as a general buzz filled the room. Brian lifted his head and looked at her. "Miss, are you all right?" Brian's concern for her always warmed her heart. "Yes, Brian, thank you. Just some family issues. I'll be okay." She gave him a weak smile. Judge Atkinson cleared his throat and the buzz in the courtroom died down. "Thank you, members of the jury. We'll adjourn for now and reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow for final instructions. Good night and thank you for your time." Everyone rose as the judge stood and exited the room. Gathering her papers, Grace tossed them into her briefcase. "I've got to go, Brian." "But how did you do?" She nodded her head towards Niall, who stood with his team on the opposite side of the bench. An unwelcome pang of jealousy stabbed her as a young attractive blonde hung on his every word. "Oh, he did well, as expected, but I think we've got it." "Nothing's ever definite until the jury comes back. You know that, Brian." "Yes, miss, I do. They can go either way, but if I were a betting man, I'd bet on you." "Oh, Brian, what would I do without you?" Grace let out a small laugh. "I really do have to fly. I'll see you in the morning." "Okay, miss. Good night." "Good night, Brian." Grace swept her robe around her shoulders and hurried towards the exit. shooting one quick look at Niall before leaving the room. The blonde was standing way too close. Grace sighed dejectedly. Will I ever get over him? Stupid, really. It was her fault they'd broken up. She didn't want to get married. He did. Too late now. The blonde had her hooks into him. Grace glanced at her watch. She could change, but no, time was of the essence. She'd go straight to the hospital. What if something happened to Brianna in the time it took to return to Chambers? As Grace turned into Frew Lane, biting wind caught her robe and sent it flying. Grabbing it, she pulled it tighter. But as she paused, a deep voice she'd know anywhere called out. Grace stopped and turned. Niall was jogging towards her. Her heart fluttered. Drat the man! How does he do that? Niall stopped and stood beside her, wig in hand, his chest expanding and contracting heavily as he caught his breath. Grace, what's happened? I saw you disappear. His warm brown eyes gazed into hers as he touched her arm lightly, threatening to dismantle her resolve to remain aloof. You don't look too good. Grace lowered her eyes. Allowing him back into her life would be asking for trouble. But she could surely do with a friend right now. No, she was strong, and she didn't need anyone. Especially Niall. Get a grip, Grace. She inhaled deeply and lifted her head. It's nothing really, Niall. Just a small family matter. Niall tilted his head, a quizzical look on his way too handsome face. Doesn't look like that to me, Grace. He knew her too well. Where are you racing off to? Grace shook her head and pulled her robe higher around her neck. A light drizzle had begun to fall. People scurried past, hurrying to get home before the skies opened up. Niall opened the umbrella he'd been holding in one hand and held it over her. The gentleman, as always. Come on, Grace, let's get out of this. Let me drive you to where you're going. Grace stiffened. Should she let her defences down just a little? If she did, would she be able to put them back up again? Or would she succumb to Niall's charms and let all her resolves fly out the window? She looked into the eyes of the only man she'd ever loved, and weakened. Niall's hand rested on her elbow as he guided her towards the car park around the corner, stopping in front of a silver 1982 Alfa Romeo Spider. Grace cast her eyes over the tiny sports car and approved. She and Niall had always shared a penchant for fast cars. Niall's seatbelt clicked. As he turned the key, the Spider sprang to life, the roar of the engine thrilling her. He turned and looked at her. So where are we off to? Grace had to tear her eyes away from his before she did something she'd regret. He was way too close for comfort. St. Vincent's. Grace's gaze was firmly fixed on the road ahead. Brianna is overdosed. Chapter 2. Niall manoeuvred the Spider into a tight car park and turned off the engine, turning his head towards her. I can go in by myself, Niall. You don't have to come. I'd like to if you'll let me. Grace let out a heavy sigh. I really am okay on my own. I know, but I'd like to be there for you. His steady gaze bore into her, unnerving her. Grace inhaled deeply. How much longer could she resist him? But she had to. Nothing had changed, and she couldn't, or wouldn't, allow her past to possibly destroy the career of the only man she'd loved. He could have the blonde. It would do Grace no good to get entangled with him again. She pushed her door open. We need to hurry. She's in the emergency department. Okay then, let's go. He jumped out of the car and joined her. Grace strode as fast as she could in her high heels. Niall easily kept up. She knew exactly where to go. How many times had she and Caleb been through this? Not only with Brianna, but with Brendan, their younger brother too. What a messed up family they were. Would Brianna make it this time, or would she finally succeed with her death wish? It didn't seem to matter how many times Grace and Caleb talked to her about making changes in her life. She never saw them through. Of course, Caleb always tried to talk to her about God. "God can help you, Brianna," he'd always say. Grace would roll her eyes and then go on to tell Brianna to get a grip on herself. Neither approach had worked. Brianna had a death wish. Grace hoped that today her wish would once again be denied. "She's in there, Miss O'Connor." The nurse at the reception desk tilted her head towards a curtained-off cubicle to the right. Not only was Grace a well-known figure in the emergency department, she was often featured on the nightly news. The high-profile barrister with the drug-addicted sister, both with secrets they'd hidden since fleeing Aunt Hilda's all those years ago. If ever the media got wind of... No, she wouldn't go there. She'd worked too hard to leave it all behind, and she'd done well for herself. No one would have expected poor, motherless Grace O'Connor to amount to anything. She'd show them. But Brianna? Different story altogether. Brianna was allowing her past to destroy her. Grace followed the direction the nurse indicated and paused before entering. What would she find? Each time this happened, Brianna looked worse. Grace drew a steadying breath. Time to find out. Brianna lay in bed with a myriad of tubes hanging out of her nose and arm. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing. Grace sighed in relief. Caleb squeezed her arm. "Looks like she's going to make it, Grace." Caleb looked better than he had an hour or so ago. Colour had returned to his face, and his troubled look had eased. "So glad to hear that, Caleb. What did you do this time?" Pulling her scarf off, Grace placed it on the chair beside her bag and took Brianna's hand. "Tablets. They've pumped her stomach." Grace sucked in a deep breath and released it slowly. "Silly girl." A wave of sadness flowed through her. Brianna looked so fragile. Her eye sockets had sunk into her filthy face, and her hair looked like it hadn't been brushed for days, possibly weeks. Grace gently pushed back with her fingertips the strands of hair hanging over Brianna's face. "Why, Brianna? Why?" Grace forced back the tears, pricking her eyes. She knew why, but how many more times could they go through this? Something had to change. After all they'd been through, she couldn't lose Brianna now. Her heart ached for her sister she'd shared so much with. Life hadn't been fair to either of them, but for Brianna, it had been worse. She wasn't as strong as Grace, and where Grace had determined not to let her past dictate her future, Brianna didn't have the same resilience or determination. Grace squeezed Brianna's hand and leaned forward, placing a kiss on her sister's hollow cheek. A tear fell from Grace's eye and splashed onto Brianna's cheek, leaving a muddy streak as it trickled down her face. A hand on Grace's shoulder jolted her. She remained still, hesitant to move, before slowly lifting her hand and placing it over Niall's. Warmth filled her body. Niall knew how close she was to Brianna. How many nights had they gone out searching for her in the past? How many times had she cried on his shoulder when they'd come home without her? Grace closed her eyes and steadied herself. Niall's hand on her shoulder meant nothing. It was just his way of showing concern. Nothing more, nothing less. She couldn't have him or any other man in her life. It wouldn't be fair to them. She was better off without them. And Brianna certainly was too. If only Brianna hadn't caught the attention of their cousins. Grace gritted her teeth. What they'd done to her little sister still made her blood boil. She should prosecute them. How many times had she pictured it, bringing those pieces of filth to justice? But if she did, her career would be over. Grace had no doubt Aunt Hilda would expose her secret if she did, and meanwhile, Brianna suffered. Grace inhaled deeply and rose, letting Brianna's hand slip out of hers. Niall moved back, allowing Grace room to turn. As she did, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze. She swallowed hard. Her heart skittered as she looked into those soft brown eyes she knew so well. Why are you here, Niall, after all this time? She brushed against him lightly as she inched along Brianna's bed towards Caleb, who stood at the end of the bed, arms crossed, legs astride, deep in conversation with the doctor. Miss O'Connor. Dr. Thompson held out his hand. His face was serious and his voice less than friendly. He must be getting tired of treating their sister. Grace took his hand and shook it. Hello, Dr. Thompson. This is Niall Flannery, a colleague of mine. A colleague? The two men shook hands. Your sister had a close call this time, Miss O'Connor, but I think she'll pull through. We'll know more in the morning. Grace glanced at Brianna lying in the bed, and her shoulders fell. If only she could wrap Brianna in her arms and protect her from the demons that haunted her. Lying in the bed, she looked so helpless, so thin, so dirty, so unloved. And yet she had been such a beauty when she was young, with her russet locks that bounced on her shoulders whenever she rang, and her hazel eyes that lit up every time she laughed. Maybe she'd been too pretty. Maybe that had been her downfall. Grace breathed deeply and gulped. She'd already made her decision. She looked at Dr. Thompson, and then at Caleb. I'd like Brianna to come back to my place when she's released. I want to look after her. Caleb's eyes widened. We've talked about this before, Grace. How will you cope with your job? I'll cope. I'll cut back my workload. It'll be fine. You know what she's like, Grace. Caleb reached for Grace's hand and held her gaze. Her brother's sensitivity was at odds with his appearance. Always had been. She and Caleb had shared the burden of being Brianna's keepers for years, and Caleb had often taken time off from his job at the shipyards without pay to care for her. Brianna had stayed with Caleb and Caitlin and their two young daughters several times, but she'd never lasted more than a few days at a time. It seemed Brianna couldn't handle more than that, and she often disappeared without a word after stealing whatever she could, leaving behind a heartbroken brother, sister-in-law, and two little nieces. Yes, I do, but I want to do this, Caleb. Grace moved towards Brianna and eased herself onto the bed. Pulling a tissue from a box on the stand, she gently wiped away the dirt caked on her sister's face as she pushed back the tears pricking her own eyes. She would take Brianna home to her apartment and care for her. And once and for all, she'd get Brianna clean. Chapter 3. Let's get a bite to eat, Grace. Would you like to join us, Caleb? Grace stiffened as Niall placed his hand against the small of her back as they walked along the corridor towards the car park. What was Niall doing? She hadn't agreed to go out with him, but the thought of going home to an empty apartment didn't appeal. Despite her resolve, Grace's heart beat faster at the prospect of spending time alone with Niall, even though it couldn't lead anywhere. Caleb ran a hand along the side of his head. Thanks, Niall, but I need to get home to Katie and the girls. They'll want to know how Brianna is. Besides, knowing Katie, she'll have dinner waiting for me. No problem, Caleb. Niall flashed him a smile. Give my regards to Caitlin, will you? Will do. See you in the morning, Grace. Caleb kissed Grace on her cheek and shook Niall's hand before leaving them and heading off towards his car. Well? Niall tilted his head, a mischievous grin growing on his face as he held the car door open for her. I know you haven't eaten. One eyebrow lifted, and as much as she tried, she couldn't tear her eyes away from his. This was happening way too fast. All week she'd tried to avoid him, all the while trying to ignore the fluttering of her heart every time her eyes locked with his, and the stab of jealousy when the blonde leaned too close. She angled her head. Weren't they an item? It seemed that way. So what was Niall doing here with her? Asking her out for a meal, especially when he knew there was no future for them. She couldn't have made that any clearer when she'd turned down his proposal several years ago. Maybe he was just after a casual fling? Grace stilled her beating heart. All right, let's get something to eat. She slid under his arm and sank deep into the soft leather seat, hoping she'd made the right decision. The roar of the spider's engine once again sent a thrill through her body. Niall glanced at her, a wicked grin sitting on his face. He knew her too well. Blow it. She'd relax and enjoy the ride, get her mind off Brianna and the court case for a while. She drew in a breath and laughed as he thrust the gear stick into first and accelerated out of the park a little too fast. She wasn't surprised when he pulled out outside Molly's cafe, their favourite place to chill when they'd been a couple. But they weren't a couple now, and Grace hadn't ventured inside Molly's since the last time she'd been there with Niall, almost 5 years ago. Had he chosen Molly's just because it was convenient, or was he trying to revive their relationship? She had made it clear she'd never marry, and he'd made it clear if she wouldn't marry him, then it was over. So what was he playing at? Had he changed his mind? And if he had, would she let him back into her life again? Her heart pounded. This was all so unexpected and unplanned. Niall opened the door for her. Grace peeled her long legs out of the car and took his waiting hand. Not that she needed help, but it would have been rude to ignore it. "Thank you." She flashed him a smile, and then, once steady on her feet, let go of his hand and moved aside to allow him to close the door. Molly's cafe hadn't changed. The heavy timber doors were slightly more weathered, but the cheerful exterior still enticed passers-by to enter. Grace followed Niall as he weaved his way through the scattered tables to their usual booth at the back. They'd always liked sitting here, tucked away from the main area, away from prying eyes. But it was all too familiar. Grace slid into the seat opposite Niall, tucking her bag beside her. The candlelight accentuated the grey flecks in his hair, giving him a distinguished appearance. She lowered her eyes, needing a moment to compose herself. A young waitress stood before them with pen and pad in hand. Her dark hair was piled into a loose bun, and her green apron tied at the waist sat over a plain white blouse and a short black skirt. She could have easily been the waitress who served them 5 years ago. "Can I take your orders?" Niall looked up and smiled. "Not quite ready, sorry. Could you come back in a few minutes?" "Sure." She gave the table a quick wipe and then scooted off to the next table. "What would you like?" Niall's voice was so smooth, so familiar. Grace gulped and picked up the menu, saying, "I'm not sure yet," as she opened it, thankful for the distraction. She decided on a chicken parmigiana, and he chose a beef and Guinness pie. Once their orders were placed, Grace decided enough was enough. She wouldn't let Niall's presence affect her any more. She'd converse with him as if he were any other person she was having a meal with. Grace lifted her gaze and held it steady. She could do this. "What brought you back to Belfast?" Niall wrapped his hand around his coffee mug. "I was wondering when you'd ask that." He met her gaze, his expression growing serious. "Father had a health scare recently. He asked me to come back and help so he could reduce his workload. Doctor's orders." He raised his eyebrows. "So here I am." Grace straightened and leaned forward. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is he all right?" She didn't like to think that Randall Flannery, a successful barrister known for his skill and tenacity and his passion for helping the downtrodden, would be out of action for long. She enjoyed the time she met him as opposing counsel. "Yes, but he has to take it easy if he wants to avoid a full heart attack. You know how hard he works." "Yes, I do. But don't we all?" Niall looked down at his mug. "I'm sure he'll be fine, but he won't like not being at work." "It might do him good, though." Grace sipped her gin and tonic as her thoughts turned to Niall's parents. Niall's mother, Leah Flannery, had always welcomed Grace warmly. In many ways, Leah was the mother Grace yearned for after her own mother died when she was 12, and she and Brianna were sent to live with Aunt Hilda. Leah Flannery was everything Aunt Hilda wasn't. Cheery, happy, and kind. Aunt Hilda was stern, cold, and demanding. The memories of Leah's warmth towards her tugged at Grace's heartstrings, and her voice softened. "How's your mother?" Niall's eyes lit up and he let out a small laugh. "As busy and involved as ever. I don't know where she gets her energy from." "I'm glad to hear that. Your mother is a wonderful woman." Grace blinked back tears. "You're very lucky." "I know." Niall paused, his gaze locked on hers. "But I also came back because of you." Grace froze. Had she heard right? Niall came back because of her? Why would he do that when he knew she'd never marry him? Plus, wasn't he with the blonde? She needed to find out. "I thought you were with that blonde." Niall laughed. "Absolutely not." Grace raised a brow. "She looks at you as if she owns you." "I'm not sure why. I'm definitely not interested in her." Grace wasn't sure if she was relieved or not. Leaning forward and keeping his gaze steady, Niall took her hand in his slender one. His eyes were filled with a curious, deep longing, and she fought to control her swirling emotions. "All the time I spent away, I couldn't get you out of my mind. I haven't dated anyone seriously since you, Grace. And seeing you again this week has made me want you more than ever." Grace let out a shaky laugh. "Niall, don't." "It's true. We weren't just lovers. We were best friends, and I've missed you so much." His brown eyes didn't waver as he laced his fingers with hers. They just grew softer and needier. Why was he doing this? He was right. They'd been best friends before they became lovers. And it had taken everything she had to turn down his proposal. What girl in her right mind wouldn't want to marry Niall Flannery? But she'd had no choice. Her past, if it ever came to light, would ruin not only her career, but his as well if they were married. There was no way she could do that to him. He squeezed her hand. "Can we start again, Grace?" Grace bit her lip. Why was he putting her through all of this again? He wasn't just after a casual fling. He wanted to revive their relationship, and she couldn't do it. As much as she wanted to, she couldn't. Nothing had changed. The waitress appeared and placed their meals in front of them, but Grace's appetite had fled. She downed her gin and tonic and asked for another. Niall was still waiting for an answer. She had to tell him. It was no use prolonging it. She drew a breath. "I can't do this, Niall. Not now, not ever. I'm sorry." She gulped. A muscle in his jaw twitched as he held her gaze. "I don't understand." She shook her head. "I just can't do it. I'm sorry." She couldn't hold his gaze any longer. "I need to go. I'll call a taxi." As she stood, Niall gripped her hand. "Grace, don't do this." The desperation in Niall's voice almost made her change her mind. How she hated hurting him like this again. But it was for his own good. He just didn't know it. "I have to. I'm sorry." Pulling her hand away, she threw her wrap over her shoulder, raced outside, and hailed a taxi. When Grace entered her apartment a short while later, she headed straight to the drinks cabinet and poured herself a double. Trapped by the secrets of her past, she was defeated. She felt bereft and desolate. Leaning against the cabinet, she squeezed her eyes shut as her heart ached with the pain of lost love. If only Niall hadn't returned. She'd been doing fine. Work had been her solace. But now she'd have to build her walls higher. She drew a long, slow breath and downed her drink before collapsing on her bed. Chapter 4. The following morning, Grace entered the powder room at the courthouse and placed her briefcase on the floor. Leaning into the mirror, she inspected her face. She looked better than she felt. The eye drops had worked their magic, and her eyes had cleared. She splashed her face and patted it dry with a paper towel before reapplying some face powder and lipstick. Tucking a stray hair under her wig, she studied herself again. She would pass, but only just. Lifting her chin, She drew a deep breath and rejoined her team in the foyer. Brian gave her a warm smile. Better? Yes, thank you, Brian. She returned his smile. 5 minutes later, Grace took her seat beside Brian and forced herself to not even glance at the opposing council seats. Niall would be there by now, and she couldn't risk catching his eye. Judge Atkinson entered, and everyone stood. Grace made herself focus. As well as dealing with Niall's presence, Caleb's phone call earlier that morning weighed on her mind. But she'd have to deal with Brianna's release after the judge had finished his summing up and the jury had been instructed. Only once during the judge's summary did Grace steal a glance at Niall. She shouldn't have. The uncomfortable ache in her chest returned at the mere sight of him. Her eyes blurred with tears, and she tore her gaze away, forcing all thoughts of what might have been away and focusing instead on the judge. It didn't take long, and in less than 30 minutes, Grace was heading back to the chambers with Brian. Niall felt an acute sense of loss as Grace walked out of the courtroom. He still didn't understand. She had no one else in her life. He'd checked, but Grace had never given him the real reason why she couldn't marry him. He let out a heavy sigh. He'd hoped fleeing to London after she'd turned him down, instead of taking the job with his father's firm in Belfast, would have got her out of his mind, and his heart, but seeing her over this past week had confirmed to him that he still loved her. He'd just have to convince her of that, and do everything in his power to win her back. Grace checked her schedule and rearranged a few things. She would have to return to court as soon as the jury came back, but that could be days. She got the impression they might be split. She and Niall had both done a good job. Donal O'Malley was guilty, no doubt about it, but had she done enough to convince the jury? Niall certainly had done a good job of attacking her argument and casting doubt. Time would tell, but right now, Brianna needed her. When Grace entered Brianna's cubicle a short while later, Brianna was sitting up in bed. Her hair was still a mess, but at least her face was clean. "Hiya." Grace leaned down and kissed Brianna's cheek, brushing the unruly hair off her face. Brianna's expression remained unmoved. Grace sighed. This was going to be an uphill battle. She felt like shaking Brianna. Why couldn't she just kick the habit and get on with life? Grace hated weakness in people, but this was her sister. And if anyone knew what Brianna had been through, it was her. But still, why couldn't she just sort herself out? It was so frustrating. Sitting beside Brianna on the bed, Grace took her sister's cold, bony hand. "How are you feeling, baby?" Brianna gave a slight shrug and turned her head away. Grace bit her lip and glared at her. "Brianna, look at me." Forcing herself to remain calm, Grace waited. Brianna slowly turned her head towards Grace and lifted her dull, lifeless eyes. "Go away, Grace. You're wasting your time." Grace clenched her fist. She wasn't going to let Brianna have her way. "No, I won't go away, Brianna. I don't care what you say. I'm not going to let you do this again. You're coming home with me and I'm going to look after you." Brianna jeered at her. "To your fancy apartment? Yeah, right. What would your neighbours think? I don't think so, Grace. Just let me be." Turning her back on Grace, she slid down the bed and curled up, pulling the blankets around her neck. Grace seethed. She felt like yanking the blankets off Brianna and shaking her. How dare she talk to her like that? "I'm not going anywhere, Brianna. I've made up my mind." It would be so easy to walk out and leave Brianna to her own demise. Grace was sure that's what Brianna wanted, but she couldn't do that. Having looked out for Brianna her whole life, she wasn't prepared to let her go now. The doctor entered the cubicle and picked up Brianna's chart. After giving Brianna a quick check, he told Grace Brianna was clear to leave. After the doctor left, Grace rubbed Brianna's arm. "Okay, time to go, like it or not." Brianna grunted and slowly pulled herself up. "Why can't I go to Caleb's?" Grace gagged at Brianna's stale breath. "Because you're coming with me." Obviously, Brianna would have preferred to go home with Caleb, but tough. This time she was coming home with her. She'd get off those drugs if it killed Grace in the process. Caleb was too soft. Brianna needed someone who'd tell her how it is, and not just tell her she needed God. "Let me brush your hair before we leave. It looks like a rat nested in it." But Brianna's hair was so matted that Grace couldn't get a brush through it. Instead, she tied it up with a hair tie she found in her purse. "We'll have to sort it when we get home." After signing the necessary paperwork, Grace led Brianna to her car and helped her in. It wasn't a long drive to her downtown apartment, and within half an hour she was helping Brianna settle into her room. "There are more blankets if you need them, and the bathroom's just through here. But first, let's give you a wash and sort out that hair."
"It's fine the way it is, Grace."
Grace's blood boiled at the defiance in Brianna's expression. She put her hands on her hips and stared Brianna down. "It is not fine the way it is, Brianna. You probably have bugs. Let alone the fact you can't get a brush through it. I'll run a bath and we'll get you clean at least. But then we have to do something with it." She gave Brianna no choice, and as she sponged her sister's emaciated body, her heart almost broke. What had happened to her beautiful little sister? It was all Da's fault. If he hadn't deserted their Mam, leaving her to raise 8 young children on her own, Mam wouldn't have run herself into the ground and died so young. And then she and Brianna wouldn't have been sent to Aunt Hilda's. How Daniel and Caleb had ever forgiven Da before he died was beyond her. "There. Better?" Grace poured warm water down Brianna's back and then rested her hand on her bony shoulder. Brianna nodded slowly. Tears rolled down Grace's cheek as she leaned forward and hugged her sister. "It's going to be all right, baby. We're going to get you fixed." Brianna slept for 5 hours. Grace looked in on her every 10 minutes or so. She couldn't relax. What was she going to do with her? If they stayed here in the apartment, Brianna would pack up and leave within days, as she always did at Caleb and Caitlin's. They'd tried putting her into a rehab facility several times, but she'd never lasted. Brianna needed a change of scenery, a complete change. Grace started to formulate a plan. As soon as the jury came back and delivered their verdict, she'd take Brianna on a road trip. They'd drive to the sea, let the wind and the fresh air blow away all of Brianna's troubles. Yes, that's what they'd do. Caleb thought it was a grand idea. "Why don't I put in for holidays and Caitlin and I and the girls can join you?" Grace's heart fell. How could she tell Caleb she wanted to do this on her own without hurting his feelings? She just had to tell him. "I'd like to spend some time alone with Brianna first if that's okay with you, Caleb. But maybe you and the girls can join us after a while? Once Brianna's stable?" Caleb pursed his lips, but eventually agreed. "We'll pray for you." "Thanks, Caleb." She couldn't tell him she didn't need his prayers when she'd just told him she didn't want him on the trip. She hugged him when he went to leave. "You're a good brother, Caleb. The best." She smiled warmly into his face, and their shared history flashed through her mind. Apart from Brianna, Caleb was the sibling she knew the best, and the one she could depend on if ever she needed anything. She just needed to do this trip without him. "And you're not too bad yourself, sis." He winked at her as he pecked her on the cheek and disappeared down the hallway. Chapter 5. Brianna reluctantly allowed Grace to cut her hair and treat it with bug shampoo. She also allowed Grace to dye it her natural russet colour. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognise the person looking back. Grace had made her eat small, regular meals, and she'd already put on some weight. She hadn't left Grace's apartment since the day Grace had brought her here. The few times she'd asked Grace to let her go out, Grace refused. Apart from jumping off the balcony, there was no way out. She felt like a prisoner. For the first day or so, they'd spend most of their time watching television. Grace tried to get her talking, but she didn't feel like it. She'd slept a lot, but whenever she was up, she couldn't relax. Grace wouldn't let her have a drink, although she was allowed the occasional cigarette. Big deal. What she wanted, needed more than anything, was a hit. Grace had told her she was to go cold turkey. She'd done it before and hated it. As each day passed, Brianna craved her drugs more and more. Her body went into withdrawal. She felt sick. She threw up. She shivered. Grace bathed her body with cool, damp sponges. She lashed out at Grace, scratched Grace's face, threw objects around her room, and threw herself onto the bed and screamed. On the third night, when her body was racked with cramps, she thrashed her arms about and pummeled Grace's chest.
I can't do this, Grace. Let me go.
Grace caught Brianna's arms and held them above her head. Finally calming, she sobbed into Grace's chest. You're almost there, Bibi. You can do this. Grace rubbed Brianna's back and pulled her close. Maybe she could, but she hated it. Why couldn't they just let her be? The jury returned 4 days after they were dismissed. Grace had Caitlin on call to sit with Brianna while she was gone, and within the hour of receiving the phone call, Grace was wigged up and sitting in court beside Brian. To be honest, she'd almost forgotten the case was still in progress. She'd hardly given Donald O'Malley a thought since she'd taken Brianna home. And she'd tried not to think about Niall. But there he was, with the blonde still looking like she owned him. Grace turned her head away quickly when Niall caught her looking at him, but one moment was enough. Her heart still refused to listen to her head. Judge Atkinson entered and everyone rose. Donald O'Malley was expressionless as the jury's foreman read out the verdict of guilty. Brian grabbed Grace's arm and squeezed it. Grace glanced once again at Niall. The blonde had her hand on top of his. It was over, and she'd won. She should have felt relieved, elated, but instead she felt nothing. Becoming a top barrister had always been her dream, and how hard she'd worked to get there, but now she felt empty. Had it really been worth all the effort? Maybe if she'd spent more time with Brianna rather than studying and working so hard, Brianna might not have ended up in the gutter. At the time it seemed the right thing to do, but now? She was looking forward to the break. Would she miss the courtroom with all its pomp and ceremony? Would she miss the kick she got from standing in the front of a packed courtroom making witnesses and defendants squirm? Probably. But right now, she didn't care. She said goodbye to Brian and shook Niall's hand, as protocol demanded, trying to avoid his eye, but when he slipped an envelope into her hand, she glanced up and met his gaze. He didn't say a word, just looked at her with soft brown eyes that almost made her resolve fly out the window. She gulped and turned away. She didn't trust herself to speak. When Grace returned to her apartment, she opened the door quietly and tiptoed inside. Caitlin was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, and looked up as Grace put her briefcase down. "How is she?" Grace whispered as she glanced towards Brianna's room and slipped her jacket off. "She slept the whole time." Caitlin's jolly face seemed to be getting rounder by the day. "Not a peep out of her." "That's a relief. Coffee?" "Yes, please, that would be lovely." Caitlin eased herself off the couch and joined Grace at the breakfast bar. "When are you planning on leaving?" Grace stood with her arms folded, leaning back against the counter. "Now the case is over, tomorrow, I hope. Brianna's really fidgety, and I need to get her out of here as soon as I can. We could even leave today." Grace felt brighter at the thought. Grace had rarely talked to Caitlin on her own. Usually, Caitlin was with Caleb, and she let Caleb do most of the talking. But Grace knew Caitlin to be a caring wife and mother, and a devout Christian, Maybe that was one of the reasons Grace had avoided being with her on her own. She had heard Caitlin had a knack of getting under people's outer layers, breaking through the walls they'd put up. Grace had many walls, and she didn't want Caitlin or anybody else getting under, over, or through them. "Where are you thinking of going?" Grace lifted 2 brightly coloured mugs from the cupboard. "We might head north and then go along the coast and see what happens after that. Neither of us have seen much of the country, so we'll just take it a day at a time." "Sounds super. Brianna must be looking forward to it." "Yeah, she is surprisingly. Milk? Sugar?" Caitlin settled herself onto a stool. "Yes, please, 3 sugars." Grace raised an eyebrow. No wonder she's stacking it on. Caitlin didn't seem to notice. "Have you ever thought about going to Danny's place?" Grace's head jerked up. "Danny's place?" "Yes, I thought Caleb would have mentioned it." Grace joined Caitlin on another stool. "He may have, but I probably didn't take much notice." She always stopped listening whenever Caleb started talking to her about what Daniel and Lizzie were doing, since it usually included something to do with the Bible college where they worked, and she simply wasn't interested. The only time she'd ever really listened was when Caleb told her about her little niece and nephew, and that was over a year ago. "Well, I think it would be perfect for Brianna. He and Lizzie are managing the place where young people go if they're struggling to fit in or can't stay out of trouble." She paused and took a sip of her coffee. "It's not rehab. It's not a college. I guess it's somewhere in between. They've had a lot of young people through already with quite a lot of success. The students, as they call them, work for half a day, and they have lessons for the other half in the evening, all the while living in community with counsellors on hand, 24/7. Caitlin's eyes twinkled as she spoke, and her second chin wobbled. "I guess it's a church-run place?" Grace had no doubt, but asked anyway. "Yes, it's sponsored by the college Daniel worked at. Caleb and I also support it financially, as do a lot of others. It's a great ministry, and I think it'd be perfect for Brianna." She placed her chubby hand gently on Grace's wrist. "Think about it, Grace. I'm sure they'd welcome both of you." Caitlin stopped and laughed. "I didn't mean you as a student. They'd welcome you as a guest." She let out another chuckle. "Such a jolly person, and she means well, but no, I won't be taking Brianna there." "Thanks for the information, Caitlin. I'll keep it in mind." Grace finished her coffee just as Brianna appeared in the kitchen. "Hey, BB, how are you feeling?" Slipping off her stool, Grace hugged Brianna and kissed her forehead.
Okay, I guess. Did you win?
Grace's head jolted up. The case. She'd forgotten already. "Yes, we won. It's all over now, and we can head off as soon as we're ready. Do you want a drink?"
Yes, please.
"How are you, Brianna? Doing better?" Caitlin reached out and squeezed Brianna's arm gently as Brianna took a seat beside her.
"I'm getting there, but Grace has kept me locked up."
She shot Grace a less than kind look. "It's worked though, Brianna. You haven't taken any drugs since you were taken to the hospital."
"I almost died though."
She pouted, but took the mug of steaming hot coffee Grace handed her. "You might have died if I hadn't brought you here." Grace raised her brow. "I see you two are going to have a fun trip. You sound just like my two, always bickering." Caitlin let out a jolly laugh. "Anyway, I'd better be off. Ladies lunching at church today." She paused and looked at Grace. "Guess you don't want to come?" Grace shook her head. She was right. "No harm in asking," Caitlin chuckled. "Sorry, maybe another time." She was just being polite. She would never go to a ladies' luncheon at church. "Thanks so much for coming today." Grace leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. "My pleasure. And have a wonderful trip, the two of you." She gave Brianna a huge hug and bustled out the door.
Phew, I'm glad she's gone.
Brianna settled into one of Grace's leather armchairs with her mug of coffee, tucking her legs underneath her. "She means well."
I guess so. But she's so gooey and squidgy.
Grace laughed. That's one way to describe her. Brianna rolled her eyes and joined in with Grace's laughter. It was so good to see the real Brianna finally emerging from the depths of darkness. So, Bibi, do you want to leave today? Grace sat down opposite her with another mug of coffee. Brianna stopped laughing and locked eyes with Grace.
You mean I finally get to leave here?
It was for your own good, Bibi. I didn't do it for fun, you know. Grace held her mug with both hands and let out a sigh.
I understand, and thank you, Grace.
Brianna's eyes watered.
I mean it. I can't promise to stay off the stuff forever, but I'll try. I just hope you know what you're letting yourself in for.
Grace shrugged. I'm tough. I'll cope with whatever. Chapter 6. Grace packed quickly. Brianna had very little, so Grace lent her what she could and promised to buy whatever she needed along the way. There wasn't much room in Grace's sports car anyway. Grace was tempted not to take the envelope Niall had given her, but against her better judgment tossed it into her bag. She'd read it later, although it would do her heart no good. They headed north out of the city, Brianna's body visibly relaxed when Grace took the A2 and not the M2 towards Londonderry. Neither she nor Brianna had been back to Londonderry since they'd fled Aunt Hilda's house when Brianna was 4 months pregnant. The memories were too painful, and neither girl dared look down that road. It was a warm day, and Grace had the roof down. She wore a bright red scarf to help keep her hair in place, but as she'd cut Brianna's hair so short, Brianna had no need of one. She did give her a pair of Oroton sunglasses, though. Grace glanced at Brianna as she accelerated onto the open road and smiled. She hadn't seen Brianna looking so relaxed for a long time. It was impossible to talk, so Grace just enjoyed being out in the country. It had been way too long. She and Niall used to go for long drives on weekends. In fact, his parents lived just off this road. She peered down Derry Lane as they flew past the intersection, and she just made out the roofline on the large country manor Randall and Leah Flannery had lived in their entire married lives. Thinking of them made her glance at her bag holding Niall's envelope. He probably had nothing new to say. She should have left it behind or tossed it in the bin, but it was a link. A little part of him she could hold close to her heart. The afternoon drew in, and as they hadn't booked anywhere, Grace slowed down at the next town they came to. The small village of Lorne hugged the banks of Glendon River, and 2 pubs, a church, and a few shops lined the road. Signs advertising the local bed and breakfast places were scattered here and there. The pubs looked less than inviting, not somewhere to take Brianna on their first night. One of the bed and breakfast places would be better. Which one, Bibi? Grace pulled the sports car to a stop as they looked at the signs. Neither one stood out, but as Brianna didn't have any preference, Grace chose the more expensive one. She had plenty of money, and it should be better of the two. A short round lady bustled down the stone steps, bordered on either side with overflowing brightly coloured flowers, and greeted them. She wore a grey knee-length skirt and a pink twin set with 2 strings of fake pearls draped around her chubby neck. Her face was round and kindly, and her greying hair was swept up in an old-fashioned bun. Welcome, ladies. My name's Maeve, and I'm happy to see you both. Come on in, and I'll show you to your room. She stopped suddenly. Did you want 1 room or 2? Grace glanced at Brianna. She was hanging back, and her face was blank, as if it was all too much for her. Grace held out her hand and pulled her along. 1 room, thanks, Maeve. Grace gave the woman a warm smile. I'm Grace, and this is my sister, Brianna. Nice to meet you both. And where have you come from today? Maeve bustled ahead, but stopped at the top of the stairs to catch her breath. Oh, my goodness! She patted her chest. These steps seem to be getting steeper every day. Grace let out a small laugh to be polite. Just from Belfast. We had a late start. Oh, and where are you heading? We're not sure yet. We'll just drive and see where the road takes us. There are some lovely wee towns further north, if that's what you're looking for. Thanks, we might check them out. And now here's the best room for you. It opens out onto the garden. You can take your tea out there if you like. The room, halfway down a dimly lit hallway adorned with black and white family photos, reminded Grace of a number of similar rooms she'd stayed in with Niall, except of course those rooms had a double bed. Grace's throat tightened at the memory. Maeve continued talking. Did she ever stop? Grace turned her head. Brianna had paused in the hallway and was looking at the photos. Grace reached out her hand and motioned for her to follow. There are more blankets in the cupboard if you need them, and there is a private bathroom just through here. Maeve half opened a door on the far wall of the room. What time would you be wanting breakfast? 8 o'clock would be perfect. Grace smiled politely. Are you right for dinner? If not, I could rustle something up. That's very kind, thank you, Maeve. But we might just pop back into the village and see what we can find. The Green Leprechaun does meals until 9. That's probably your best option. I wouldn't recommend the dairy alms. A bit rough for 2 young ladies like yourselves. We can look after ourselves, can't we, Bibi? But thanks, Maeve. We might check out the Green Leprechaun. Grace paid for the night and then closed the door, letting out a huge breath as she flopped backwards onto one of the beds.
I didn't think she'd ever stop talking.
Brianna walked over to the double doors leading out to the garden and looked out.
Feels strange staying in someone's home.
Grace sat up. Maybe we should have stayed at the hotel. Will you be okay here, Bibi? Grace stood and slipped her arm around Brianna's bony, fragile shoulder. Brianna shrugged.
It's too nice for the likes of me.
Oh, come on, Bibi, stop it. Grace turned Brianna around to face her and placed both her hands on Brianna's shoulders. She lifted Brianna's chin with her finger and looked into her sister's hazel eyes. Enough of all that nonsense. This holiday is about spoiling you and getting you better, so get used to it.
I'm more at home on the streets, you know that.
Brianna shook Grace's finger away and looked around the room.
All this frilly stuff.
She reached out and fingered the lace-edged lampshade on one of the bedside tables.
I've never seen so many pillows and cushions in all my life. And all these flowers. It'll do me head in.
Oh, Bibi, just relax and enjoy it. Come outside and we'll sit for a while. I'll make us some tea. Grace put the kettle on and made a pot of tea while Brianna continued to inspect the room, commenting on everything from the heavy floral duvets on each bed to the highly perfumed soaps and shampoos in the bathroom. Grace carried the tray with the teapot, 2 dainty porcelain china cups and saucers, matching side plates with a homemade scone each, and tiny pots of strawberry jam and cream outside onto their private terrace. Despite the chill in the air, the late afternoon sun peeked in through the vine-covered trellis, creating an inviting and warm sitting area. Grace felt right at home, but Brianna shivered as she perched on the edge of a cushioned cane armchair. Bibi, just relax and enjoy. Here, let me pour. As Grace poured tea into the dainty cup with delicate pink roses painted on it, she glanced at Brianna's stony face and sighed. Brianna stared at her teacup. A set just like this sat on a shelf at Aunt Hilda's in that horrible, dingy kitchen that reeked of greasy mutton and stale tobacco. Brianna's heart pounded like it did when her body was waiting for a hit. She stood, bumping the table and spilling the tea. She didn't care. She ran inside and flung herself onto the bed. This was a big mistake. Why had she let Grace talk her into it? She didn't belong in places like this. She was a drug addict, and she needed a hit, not a cup of tea in a cup she couldn't even hold without getting her fingers stuck. The bed creaked as Grace sat beside her. Brianna turned her head away.
Why can't she let me be?
Bibi, what's the matter? Grace stroked her hair, just like she used to. But that was years ago. Tears pricked Brianna's eyes as a weight settled on her chest. Where could she start? Everything was the matter. She pushed Grace away and curled into a ball. Grace leaned over her. Brianna kicked her away.
Go away, Grace!
Tears choked her voice and she could hardly breathe. Grace grabbed her and held her. Brianna struggled. She didn't want Grace's sympathy. She fought against her, but Grace was too strong and she finally gave in, sobbing uncontrollably into Grace's chest. "Oh, Bibi." Grace's voice was soft and caring. Brianna hated it. If only Grace would let her be. Brianna's sobs slowly subsided. Grace dried her face with the tissue, but kept one arm around Brianna's shoulder.
I can't do this, Grace.
She could barely speak. "Yes, you can, Bibi. Look at me." Grace tipped Brianna's chin and held her gaze. Grace's eyes were moist. "I'm here for you, whatever it takes, okay?" Brianna drew a shaky breath. She didn't want to do it. That was the problem. She needed drugs because they helped her forget. There was nothing Grace could do that would wipe her memory of those horrid years. Memories that tormented her night and day. Only the drugs sent them away. Grace tucked a lock of hair behind Brianna's ear. "I'll find those boys and prosecute them." Brianna slumped. How many times had she thought about tracking them down and making them pay for raping her when she was just 15? But Grace had told her she probably wouldn't win, and it might just make it worse, so she'd tried to forget. It was no use. Besides, the thought of facing them in court made her ill. She lifted her gaze.
No, Grace. I don't want you to.
Grace nodded slowly. "You know I'm prepared to, Bibi, if you want me to."
I just want to forget, Grace. That's all I want to do.
"You've got so much to live for, Bibi. You could be anything you want. A nurse, you could go to university, you could work in an office, you could be anything you want." Brianna's eyes moistened.
How could I do that, Grace? I didn't even finish school.
"Yes, but you can study, just like I did. I can help you. Think about it. It might help you forget." Brianna shrugged. How could she study when she could barely read? "Come on, let's clean up and get some dinner." Grace gave her a big squeeze and then stood. Brianna let out a deep sigh.
Everything's so simple for Grace, but she doesn't have a clue.
Chapter 7. Later that night, after Grace and Brianna had been out for dinner at the Green Leprechaun, a lively little place with great food, and Brianna was tucked up in bed, Grace reached for Niall's envelope. All day she'd been tempted to open it, but had stopped herself each time she'd reached for it, reminding herself she was trying to forget him. But try as she might, she couldn't get him out of her head. The light from the bedside lamp was dim, but Niall's handwriting was as strong as ever, and she could make out the words easily. She bit her lip as she read. "Grace, I'm so sorry for putting you under pressure the other night. We're soulmates, you know that. We can't turn the clock back, but I would love to be your friend if you'll let me, and to be there for you whenever you need someone to talk to. Obviously, I want more than that, but if you won't marry me, at least be my friend. Call me if you need anything at all, wherever you might be, whatever time of day or night. I'm only a phone call away. I love you, Grace, and I always will. Nothing will change that. Forever yours, Niall." Grace flopped against her pillow and held the notepaper to her chest. Part of her wanted to tear up the letter and throw it in the bin. But Niall was right. They were soulmates. Despite the years of separation, there was a bond between them, and her heart still quickened at the very thought of him. She picked up the letter and reread it. Her thoughts filtered back to the day she met him. Her first day at Belfast University. She wore a long wraparound Indian-style skirt, black knee-high boots, and a blue denim jacket. Niall was wearing skinny jeans and a blue hand-knitted cardigan. Her first thought was that someone special had made it for him. She laughed when she discovered later that the special person was his mother. They sat beside each other on their first lecture, Introduction to Law. As he chatted with her, it became apparent he was from a well-to-do family. His father was a high-profile barrister, as was his father before him, and there was never any question about Niall following in their footsteps. Grace was tempted to make up a story of her own. How could she tell Niall that she'd worked by day and studied by night just to get into university? Or that she was supporting her younger sister, whose 2-month-old baby, a result of being raped by her cousins when she was only 15, had just died? Grace gulped. Or that she herself had blown up 10 innocent people when she was only 16. He'd never believe her. In the end, she told him she'd decided to study law because she'd seen too many violent crimes go unpunished, and she wanted to do what she could to change that. She'd gone home that day with the brown-eyed Niall Flannery on her heart and her mind. And that's where he'd stayed for the next 5 years, until the night he proposed. Brianna stirred. Grace quickly folded the letter and placed it in her purse. She should throw it away, but she couldn't. She switched off the light and hoped Brianna would settle. All afternoon and night Brianna had been restless. Was it a mistake to take her away? Would it be too much for both of them? Grace hoped not, but doubt flooded through her as Brianna writhed around in bed. Grace finally climbed out of her own bed and climbed in with Brianna, wrapping her arms around her and pulling her close, just like she used to when they were first sent to live with Aunt Hilda. Brianna settled for a short while and then woke with a start, jerking to a seated position.
Where am I?
The fear and desperation in Brianna's voice tore at Grace's heart. Grace flicked on the light and sat up. Sweat dripped from Brianna's brow and her bedclothes were damp. Her face was twisted with anguish. It's okay, Bibi, I'm here. Grace wiped Brianna's brow. Were you having a nightmare? Brianna nodded and fell back onto her pillow, curling into a ball and sobbing. Grace lay back beside her and held her tight, all the while uttering soothing words until Brianna's breathing slowed and she fell asleep. Grace was almost asleep when Brianna jumped out of bed and began rummaging through her bag. What are you doing, Bibi? Grace climbed out of bed and tried to pull her back. Bibi brushed Grace's hand away. Leave me alone, I need a hit. Before Grace could stop her, Brianna upended the bag and began tossing items all around the room. Stop it, Brianna. Grace's voice was a firm whisper, but panic was setting in. Brianna couldn't give in now. Don't stop me, Grace. The determination in Brianna's face frightened Grace, but she had to stop her. No way could she let Brianna go into town on her own in the middle of the night. No, you're not going anywhere. Stop it now. Grace's pulse raced as Brianna struggled with her. Brianna jerked one hand free and slapped Grace across her face. Grace gasped and her hand flew to her smarting cheek. How dare Brianna hit her? Who did she think she was? An urgent knock on the door was enough to distract Brianna long enough for Grace to gain the upper hand. Is everything all right in there? Maeve called out in a concerned voice. Yes, thank you, Maeve. Everything's fine. Grace put on her most convincing voice as she held her hand over Brianna's mouth and tried to keep her still. Okay then, dear. If you need anything, let me know. Thank you, we will. As Maeve's footsteps receded, Brianna's body slumped and Grace loosened her hold. Wrapping her arms around Bibi, she pulled her close. We'll get through this, Bibi. You'll see. Grace's heart tore in two as Brianna sobbed uncontrollably into her chest. The following morning, Grace had trouble waking Brianna in time for breakfast. In the end, she decided to let her sleep and told Maeve they'd eat in their room. A weaker person would have given in to Maeve's inquisitive glances, but Grace held her ground and didn't say anything other than her sister was still sleeping. While Brianna slept, Grace took her tea and toast outside and sat in the gazebo. Feeble rays of sun warmed her body as she flicked through the local newspaper Maeve had provided. But her mind was on Niall's letter. Even though she'd only read it twice, the words were etched in her memory and played over in her mind. What she wouldn't give to have him here right now. Grace glanced towards the room where Brianna still slept. How long would it take for Brianna to be free from her addiction? Grace longed for her little sister to be whole again. She leaned back in her chair and her thoughts drifted to a happier time, the time before Mam died. Even though they were poor, they'd been such a happy family in the years after Da left. Brianna had always been the fun-loving girl, whereas Grace had been the studious one, but despite that, the two girls had been thicker than mud. The day they got sent to Londonderry to live with Aunt Hilda was etched in Grace's memory. The day of Mam's funeral was cold, wet, and miserable. The 8 children lined up beside her grave, and one at a time threw a handful of dirt on top of the coffin lying in that horrible, deep hole. The minister prayed for Mam's soul, but that was the day Grace told God she would never talk to him ever again. And she hadn't. Brianna cried the whole way to Londonderry. And when they were met at the bus stop by Aunt Hilda and Uncle Dougal, Brianna hid behind Grace. They were put in the back room that was no bigger than a broom closet. In fact, Grace initially thought that's what it was. It had no heating, and in winter, she and Brianna clung to each other at night to stay alive. In all the years they lived there, not once did they feel welcome. They were treated as the poor cousins who'd been taken in and were told they should be grateful for a roof over their heads. Grateful? The dogs were treated better than they were. Grace looked up as Brianna appeared in the doorway, her hair dishevelled and dark circles hanging under her eyes. Grace's heart broke. She held out her hand. "Come and sit." Brianna took Grace's hand and sat beside her. Grace poured her a cup of tea and placed it in front of her. "I'm sorry for last night." Brianna's voice was raspy and faint. Grace pushed back the tears pricking her eyes. "It's okay, Bibi. We can do this." She gave Brianna an encouraging smile, but wondered if she really believed what she'd said. "It looks like a nice day for a drive along the coast. I thought we could head to Cushendale, but we can just see how far we get." Brianna shrugged. "Whatever you think." Grace bit her tongue. It'd be nice if Brianna for once showed some enthusiasm. Maybe once they were back on the road she'd brighten a little. It didn't take long to finish breakfast, shower and pack. Maeve wore an inquisitive look as they said goodbye, but Grace pretended she didn't notice. As Grace started the engine and pulled back onto the main road, she glanced at Brianna and hoped they'd have a good day. Chapter 8. 5 days later, Grace stopped the car on top of a cliff. "Well, go on then, jump!" Grace's nostrils flared as she spat the words at Brianna. Brianna turned in her seat and reached for the door handle. A gust of wind blew the door back as she tried to open it. She wouldn't let it stop her. Gripping the door with both hands, she pushed it open and climbed out. Another gust of wind whistled past, almost knocking her off her feet. She steadied herself and inched closer to the edge. Below, angry waves crashed onto the rocks, sending sprays of water into the air. She could taste the salt on her lips. Sucking in a breath, she glanced back at Grace. Her heart was racing. Could she really do this? For the past 2 days she'd been telling Grace she just wanted to end it all, but now, could she really do it? It had been over 2 weeks since her last hit. Surely she was getting to the point where she no longer craved a high, but in the meantime it was torture. Grace had no idea. Telling her to be strong wasn't enough. Grace had nothing to offer her, and Brianna didn't have Grace's strength or willpower. Never had, never would. Grace hadn't been able to save her before, and she couldn't save her now. There was nothing to live for. Nothing. She may as well jump. The nightmares were killing her. Her head ached constantly. Her body was tired. No, she had nothing to live for. Inching closer to the edge, she lifted her chin. She wouldn't look. She'd just step forward. And then it'd all be over. No more nightmares. No more memories. She'd be free from them all. "Baby, don't do it." Grace grabbed her from behind.
"No, you can't stop me."
Brianna struggled, kicking and elbowing Grace. Sobs choked her throat, and she could barely speak. She just wanted to end it all. Why couldn't Grace let her be? She tried to free herself from Grace's hold, but she was no match for Grace. A heaviness grew in her heart, and she collapsed onto the ground. Grace crouched beside her and hugged her. Brianna curled into a ball and wept. She wept for the baby she'd loved and lost. She'd never expected to love him, but when Aidan was born, waves of love and pity flowed through her from the moment she held him. She didn't even know who his father was. It could have been either of them. Being born prematurely, Aidan had been given a 50-50 chance of living, but despite the odds, he survived. Brianna brought him home to the apartment she and Grace lived in, and for 2 months she cared for her son. Lying on her bed, she often held him close while he slept. He needed her, and she needed him. But then he got sick. That night, Brianna woke to Aidan wheezing. She jumped out of bed and shook Grace. Panic set in.
"We need to get Aidan to the hospital, Grace."
Quickly dressing, she bundled Aidan in a blanket and raced out the door. Grace hailed a taxi. Brianna's entire focus was on coaxing Aidan to breathe, but his tiny body shuddered with every weak breath he took. His face paled to a bluish tinge, and then he stopped breathing. There was nothing the doctors could do. He'd developed pneumonia, and his weak lungs couldn't handle it. She blamed herself. If only she'd looked after him better. If only they'd had better heating. It wasn't Grace's fault. She'd done the best to provide for them after fleeing Aunt Hilda's. But she was only 17, and her meagre wage from working at the hotel barely paid for rent. If only Aidan had lived, things would have been different. A seagull cried overhead, jolting her out of her memory. "Come on, baby, we need to go." Grace helped her to stand. The wind had eased, but heavy clouds had rolled in from the sea and rain was falling. She hadn't even noticed. What was ahead for her? She'd come so close to ending it all, but what now? There was no end in sight. Nothing was going to change. She needed a hit. Grace breathed a sigh of relief when she finally got Brianna back in the car. This time she thought Brianna might really do it. In some ways, it would have been easier if she had. How was she going to help her? Grace didn't want to admit defeat, but she had no answers. It would only be a matter of time before Bibi stole money off her and disappeared. She couldn't watch her 24/7. Then what would she do? Start all over again? Grace felt ill at the thought. Why couldn't Brianna just leave it all behind her and get on with life? Grace took a moment and settled herself before starting the engine. Turning to look at Brianna, her heart softened and she reached out and squeezed Brianna's hand. Tears welled in Brianna's eyes. Grace handed her a tissue. "It'll be all right, Bibi. Not much longer now." But Grace didn't believe it, so how could she expect Brianna to? Grace stared out at the dark rolling sea. Out there somewhere was Scotland. On a clear day, Grace had been told you could see it. Maybe she should take Brianna to Danny and Lizzie's place after all. Maybe they had some answers, as long as they didn't try to push God down her throat. She'd give it some thought. Days passed. Grace and Brianna drove through town after town. They visited castle after castle, drank copious amounts of coffee and spent hours upon hours walking and driving. But one day, when Grace came out of the shower and found the contents of her purse strewn all over her bed, and Brianna missing, she'd had enough. She quickly dressed and threw their bags into the car and raced out to find her. It wasn't hard. She'd headed straight for the local pub. Brianna was there. She hadn't bought any drugs, but it was only a matter of time. Grace forced Brianna into the car and headed straight to Caleb and Caitlin's home. It was all organised. Brianna had the required medical assessment and got accepted into the Elim Community Centre, the place Danny and Lizzie managed, and within a week, Grace was standing at the airport with Brianna saying goodbye to Caleb and Caitlin. She'd half expected Niall to be there. Scanning the departure lounge, her heart fell. He wasn't there. But why would he be? She hadn't even told him she was back in Belfast after the trip with Brianna. She could have called him, but if she was ever going to be able to forget him, she had to force herself not to even think about him. "Come here, sis." Caleb pulled her into his arms and hugged her tightly. "We'll be praying for you both." Grace cringed. She didn't need Caleb's prayers, but hugged him anyway. "Thank you, Caleb." She smiled into his eyes. Caleb meant well, and if he was happy praying, who was she to stop him? He gave her a kiss and let her go when final boarding was called. She picked up her carry-on luggage and walked slightly ahead of Brianna, giving a final wave before she entered the plane. Grace turned to make sure Brianna was still following. They'd come this far. She couldn't let Brianna bail on her now. She was there, but she wore a vacant look on her face, as if it was all too much for her. The past week, since the day Brianna had almost jumped, she'd been quiet and withdrawn, as if she didn't care whether she lived or died. And although it had been easier on Grace, it had also made her angry. Grace had often felt like shaking Brianna and yelling at her. Okay, she'd been through a lot, but why couldn't she just pull herself together? Grace didn't understand. Brianna shrugged and raised her eyes just enough to meet Grace's gaze. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. Grace had thought flying for the first time might have excited her a little, but no. Seemed she didn't care about anything. Grace was starting to doubt whether anything or anyone would ever get through to her. Danny and Lizzie were Brianna's last options. If they couldn't help her, Grace had no idea who could. Chapter 9. Elim Community Centre, outside Fort William, Scotland. "Come on, Daniel, we don't want to be late." Lizzie drummed her fingers on the doorframe of her husband's office and glared at him. What was he doing at his desk again? Daniel glanced up and met Lizzie's gaze. "I'm coming, give me a minute." He quickly finished what he was doing and closed his notebook before grabbing his jacket from the back of the door. He placed a kiss on Lizzie's cheek and flashed her a cheeky grin. "What's the matter, love?" Lizzie humphed, but found it impossible not to return his disarming smile. She couldn't stay angry with Daniel for long, and he knew it. "Nothing, I just want to be early for once in our lives, that's all. And we need to leave before the children come back from their walk." "Well, come on then, let's go." He grabbed her hand and led her out of the house to the waiting van. As they drove down the rough track leading to the small Highland village of Glenbranny, Lizzie snuggled closer to Daniel and placed her hand on his leg. Mist still covered the top of Ben Nevis, but there was hope the day would be fine and sunny. Lizzie rarely went anywhere these days without their 3 young children, and rarely did she see Daniel leave the community alone, so this was a special treat. Not that she minded sharing her husband with the staff and students of the community. She was still in awe the way God had blessed them. Nobody had expected their marriage to last. She'd been distraught after Matthew, the handsome student minister she'd loved dearly, broke their relationship without explanation. Daniel had come into her life when she was most vulnerable and had swept her off her feet and helped her forget about Matthew, for a time. It wasn't long before Lizzie knew she'd made a mistake by marrying Daniel. She didn't know him, and when he started drinking and mistreating her, all she could do was trust God to sort out her mess. And sort it he did. God had blessed them abundantly since the day Daniel gave his heart to the Lord following a car accident that almost took his life. 3 beautiful children, a wonderful job they could have never dreamed of, and a ministry that gave hope to those who found themselves struggling with life, just like Daniel had. And now they had the opportunity to minister to Daniel's two sisters. Lizzie's heart warmed as Daniel skillfully weaved the community van along the track that wasn't much wider than the tracks on the surrounding mountains that only the sheep and goats could navigate. She'd only met Grace once when she and Daniel and baby Dylan went to Belfast for Daniel's da's funeral just over 3 years ago. Grace had built so many walls around her. It had been difficult to talk with her, but by the time the week was over, Lizzie felt that she'd connected with Grace just a little, and she and Daniel had hope that one day Grace might reach out to them. And that day had arrived. Brianna she had yet to meet. Daniel had told her a little about their early years before all the children were separated following their mum's death, but he didn't know Brianna as well as he knew Grace. He was nervous about meeting them, even though he said he wasn't. All week he'd been on edge, not his normal, cheery self. He'd cleaned the room they'd set aside for Grace 3 times. "She won't be happy if there's even a speck of dirt, Lizzie. You've seen her apartment." And he'd gone over the basic program Brianna would be starting as soon as she arrived no fewer than 10 times. Normally, whenever students arrived, they'd go through a week of settling in before joining in with the main program, but Daniel wanted to review the whole process, not because the existing strategy wasn't working, just because it was his own sister who was coming. She told him to stop and trust God to touch their hearts. They'd prayed for both Grace and Brianna every morning and every night since the day they received the phone call, but Lizzie couldn't blame him for being anxious. Caleb had told them Brianna was a mess and Grace wasn't much better. She just didn't know it. "How are you doing, Daniel?" Lizzie turned her head and smiled at him. His dark hair was still as curly and unruly as ever, but she wouldn't have it any other way. "I'll be better once they're here, Liz. I bet they're nervous too. They have no idea what they're coming to." He chuckled as he changed down a gear to turn onto the A82 towards Inverness. "I can just see Grace's face when she sees the place. She might turn around and leave straight away." "Stop it, Daniel. It'll be fine. You're underestimating her. She's made the decision to come because she cares about Brianna, so she'll handle it. It's not that bad anyway." "It's not that great either, Liz. You know that." She raised her brow. "It's better than when we came." "Yes, but it's not what you call a fancy manor house." "No, but it's warm and welcoming, and that's the most important thing. She'll be fine, Daniel. Stop worrying." Daniel let out a slow breath. "Okay, love, I'll try." He reached down and squeezed her hand. "I wonder how the kids are." "Now you're the one worrying." "I'm not worrying." "Yes, you are." She chuckled. "Maybe just a little. I hope Mia's coping with Dylan. He's being a very cheeky 4-year-old of late." "She'll be fine with him, Liz. It's only you he misbehaves for." Lizzie let out a sigh. "I know. I guess it's normal." "And Mia's great with the twins, so don't worry about them, love." Daniel shot her a smile and gave her confidence that everything would be okay with her not there. He was right. Mia, the young woman they'd employed to be the children's nanny, was the eldest of 6 children and had a wonderful way with their 3. Lizzie had nothing to worry about. Still, they could be a handful at times. For the remainder of the 1.5-hour trip to the airport, Lizzie and Daniel chatted about anything and everything, and enjoyed their brief time together knowing that as soon as his sisters arrived, everything would change. Brianna grabbed Grace's hand as the plane accelerated and began racing down the runway. Her heart pounded and she couldn't move. She was going to die. She knew it. Strange, because when she'd decided to jump off the cliff just a week or so ago, she wasn't nearly as frightened as she was now. Why had she let Grace talk her into this? She braced herself as the plane began to lift. How was it possible for something this big to stay in the air? Grace squeezed her hand. "It's okay, baby. This is normal." Normal. Who for? The noise was too much. She was going to vomit or pass out. She closed her eyes and rested her head against the seat, all the while gripping Grace's hand as the plane banked left, and then right before steadily climbing. Her breathing slowed as the plane levelled, and she dared open her eyes. She had the window seat, but she hadn't looked out, until now. Her eyes widened as she took in the city of Belfast. It was so little from up here, and the fields spread out like patchwork. Who would have thought? She couldn't tear her eyes away. This was magic. She should have looked earlier. She'd survived, and it was amazing. Not until land was replaced by sea did she tear her eyes away and settle in her seat. See? I told you you'd be fine. Chuckling, Grace patted Brianna's hand.
It's way better than I thought.
Brianna relaxed in her seat, but when the pilot announced they'd been landing in Inverness in less than 20 minutes, she tensed again.
I don't want to do this, Grace.
Grace sighed. Do what, BB?
This.
She stared Grace down. Grace didn't flinch. It's too late, Brianna. Daniel and Lizzie will be waiting for us.
I'll just stay on the plane. You can't make me get off.
You can't do that. You have to get off. Slumping in her seat, Brianna pursed her lips and folded her arms.
Just watch me.
Grace felt the same, although she couldn't say so to Brianna. What had made her agree to this nonsense? How could Danny and Lizzie do what she herself hadn't been able to do? Brianna didn't want to change. How many chances had she had over the years? Caleb and Caitlin had gone out of their way on numerous occasions to help her, but she'd only thrown it back in their faces each time. How many times had they picked her up off the streets and taken her to hospital and then to rehab? None of it had made any difference. Brianna always returned to the gutter. Grace sighed. Maybe she should have been brave enough years ago and reported those cousins to the police, rather than be intimidated by Aunt Hilda's threats to disclose what she knew about the bombing. If Grace had been brave enough, maybe Brianna's life would have turned out differently. But so would have hers. Grace gulped. It wasn't too late. Maybe she should do it and face the consequences, even if that included prison, which no doubt it would if Aunt Hilda followed through with her threats. It would be Brianna's word against the cousins, but surely Grace's testimony would hold more weight now than it would have years ago. Her stomach tightened. But not if she was charged with murder. Aunt Hilda would say that Brianna had encouraged the boys, but it was the opposite. Both she and Brianna hated Uncle Dougal and their cousins. No way would have Brianna encouraged them. She'd just been more trusting than Grace, and she'd paid the price. The more Grace thought about it, the more determined she became. Proving the two of them guilty of rape would surely free Brianna once and for all from her demons. She'd start the ball rolling as soon as she could. It would mean going back to Londonderry with Brianna, but she'd do it if it put an end to Brianna's problems. And Aunt Hilda's threats? Well, so what if she did have the piece of paper she said she had? It proved nothing. Any good lawyer would get her off, and if they didn't, she'd go to prison so Brianna could be free. Grace closed her eyes as a cold chill ran through her body. If she was really prepared to do it, why hadn't she done it already? The flight attendant tapped her on the shoulder. "Seat up, miss." Grace's eyes shot open. She nodded and then straightened her seat. She took a deep, slow breath and turned to look at Brianna. Her seat was already upright, and her hands were clenched and her eyes squeezed shut. Was she nervous about landing, or about meeting Danny and Lizzie, or both? It was all a mistake. She shouldn't have brought her here. Brianna didn't move from her seat until the flight attendant told her she had to get up. They were last off. Brianna dragged her feet the whole way. She vomited in the toilet, and Grace had to drag her along. If there was any way to turn around, Grace would have taken it. They paused before taking the final step. Turning to face her, Grace lifted Brianna's chin and forced her sister to make eye contact. "We won't stay if you don't want to, okay? We'll go back whenever you want." Brianna's eyes widened. "Are you just tricking me?" Grace sighed. "No, I mean it. You say the word, and we'll leave." Brianna narrowed her eyes. "So why can't we leave now?" Grace sucked in a breath. "Just give it a go, BB. You never know. It might just work." She rolled her eyes. "I doubt it." Grace stepped forward and hugged her. "Come on, let's go." Chapter 10. Grace squeezed Brianna's hand and drew in a deep breath as she and Brianna stepped into the arrivals hall. Scanning the waiting faces, she easily spotted Daniel and Lizzie. Daniel had put on a little weight since she'd last seen him, the day he and Lizzie sailed back to England after Da's funeral, but apart from that, he still wore that cheeky grin and she'd know him anywhere. Lizzie, on the other hand, had changed a lot. Her hair was cut shorter into a bob. It suited her, and she'd lost weight. Must be all that running around after those children. There were hugs all round, but Brianna held back. Lizzie seemed to understand and just gave her a warm smile. Daniel put both his hands on Brianna's shoulders, his face splitting into a wide grin. Grace winced. Brianna hated being the centre of attention. But something was happening as Brianna met Danny's gaze. As if scales were falling from her eyes, and she was remembering her big brother whom she hadn't seen since she was shipped off to Aunt Hilda's at age 10. Tears rolled down Brianna's cheeks. Grace forced back tears of her own. "Brianna, welcome. It's grand to see you after all this time." Danny's eyes sparkled. He leaned forward and kissed Brianna, pulling her into a gentle hug. Brianna hugged him back. Grace couldn't believe it. But then, this was Danny. She should have known that if anyone could get through to BB, it'd be Danny. Then Danny turned to Grace. She'd been determined to remain aloof, but his infectious grin disarmed her, and before she knew it, she was stepping into his arms and hugging him like a long-lost brother. When he released her, she wiped her eyes before hugging Lizzie. "Welcome to bonny Scotland, both of you." Danny took Brianna's bags while Grace took her own and followed him to an old white van with Elam Community printed along the side. Danny must have noticed Grace's raised brow. "Sorry about the van, Grace. I know it's not quite up your standard, but it gets us around." He winked as he unlocked the vehicle and began loading their luggage. She certainly wouldn't be seen dead or alive in a van like this at home. But what did it matter? She wasn't at home. "Sit up front with me, Grace." He opened the door for her and motioned for her to get in. Grace glanced at Brianna. Lizzie seemed to have taken her under her wing. Grace smiled to herself as she climbed into the front and sat beside Danny. "Oh, this is grand, this is. 3 lovely ladies keeping me company." Daniel flashed a smile at Grace and then at Lizzie and Brianna in the back as he clicked his seatbelt in and started the engine. Laughing, Lizzie leaned forward and gave him a flick on his shoulder. "Behave yourself." "Always." He chuckled as he pulled out of the car park and onto the main road. "So, Grace, how's Caleb?" "He's fine, as usual." She turned her head. "He wanted to come." Danny shot her a quick glance as he slowed for a red light. "Why didn't he? Would have been grand to see him." Grace blew out a breath. "I didn't want him to." Danny's brows puckered. "Why?" Grace glanced quickly at Brianna. Amazing. Lizzie was chatting to Brianna as if she was a normal person. Grace leaned closer to Danny. "It would have been too much for Brianna. Caleb's a bit intense sometimes." They locked eyes for a moment. Danny understood. Grace settled back in her seat. What's the place like, Danny? Caleb didn't tell us much, apart from saying it's in the middle of the Highlands. Well, he's got that right, Danny chuckled. We are a bit isolated, but it's a good thing. Don't you miss the city? He shook his head. Not at all. Wait until you see it, Grace. It's magic. A comfortable silence fell between them for a few minutes. Grace looked out of the window and took in the sights of the city. The steep spire of the cathedral, the old-fashioned stone buildings, the dark waters of the Moray Firth, and the sprawling mountains in the distance. It wasn't that different to some of the towns she and Brianna had driven through, except that she'd half expected to see a piper in a kilt on every street corner they passed. Danny interrupted her thoughts as he changed down gears to take a corner. So how are you really, Grace? The question caught her off guard. Danny was often direct with his questions, so she should have expected it. Her immediate response was to say she was fine, but if she were honest, she was nothing of the sort. The last few weeks with Brianna had shown her she didn't have a clue how to help her sister, let alone herself. But she wouldn't admit that to Danny. I'm fine. Turning to meet her gaze, Danny raised his brow. He didn't believe her, but she wasn't prepared to say anything further. A short while later, Danny slowed the van as they entered the small town of Drumnadrochit on the western side of Loch Ness, and pulled over in front of a row of shops. Lunchtime, ladies, all out. Grace chuckled. Her brother was a charmer. Always had been, always would be, so it seemed. His love of life was infectious, and Grace couldn't help but warm to him. Grace slipped her arm loosely around Brianna's waist as they followed Danny and Lizzie into a cafe, where they were greeted by a short, friendly, middle-aged woman who spoke with a broad Scottish accent. Grace could barely understand a word she said. The lady directed them to an old wooden table near an open fireplace. Being summer, the fire wasn't lit, but Grace could imagine how cosy it would be in there when it was. The lady handed menus out to each of them. When she left, Grace opened hers and gagged. Half the menu was filled with haggis in all different variations. She lifted her gaze to Danny, who was sitting opposite her. You won't get me eating haggis, so don't even try. Danny chuckled. You don't know what you're missing out on. Lizzie laughed as she reached out and tapped Grace's wrist. Don't worry, Grace. I haven't tried it yet, and I don't intend to. Danny shook his head in mock disgust. I don't care. Lizzie glared at him and lifted her chin before bursting into laughter. Grace relaxed. It was fun being with these two, but she had to be careful. Last time she let them get too close and they'd almost broken through her walls. She didn't want that to happen again. Well, I think I'll have the soup of the day. Lizzie placed her menu on the table and sat back in her chair. That'll do me too. Grace turned to Brianna. Bibi, what do you want? Grace's heart fell. Bibi had that overwhelmed look on her face again. Of course Brianna wouldn't know what she wanted. She'd have no idea what all the menu items were. Grace's voice softened as she lowered her face towards hers. Would you like the soup, Bibi? It's potato and leek. Brianna nodded, but her eyes were dull and unresponsive. Maybe this wasn't going to work out after all. Well, I'm going to have the Guinness pie, Danny said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tummy. Grace raised her brow. So that's how he's put on weight. They ordered their meals, and Danny and Lizzie began chatting, obviously trying to make both her and Brianna feel comfortable. But their lives were so different to hers and Brianna's. They had no idea. They chatted about the children, which Grace knew was normal, but really meant nothing to her and Brianna. Children were just messy little creatures who put grubby hands on walls and ran around and screamed. But she had to listen and feign interest. Dylan's such a little monkey. You wouldn't recognize him, Grace. He runs around all day. Lizzie chuckled. He doesn't stop, does he, Daniel? She touched Danny's arm lightly, and looked at him with such love and devotion shining from her eyes, it almost made Grace envious of what they had. "I think they'll need to tie him to his chair when he starts school, if they can catch him." As Danny laughed, his blue eyes sparkled, and Grace could see how much Dylan meant to him. The twins tried to keep up with him, but their little legs don't go quite as fast. Lizzie laughed as she pulled some photos from her purse and held them out to Grace and Brianna. "This is James and Claire. They're almost 18 months. And here's Dylan. A little bigger than the last time you saw him, Grace." A proud smile sat on Lizzie's face as she glanced up. Grace looked closer at the photos. The resemblance between James and Danny was remarkable. Claire was shorter than James, but had the same facial features she herself had at that age. Caleb had given her copies of the few family photos he'd retrieved from the house after Mam died. Not that she looked at them often, just occasionally when she'd drunk too much and hankered back to happier times. She was sure that if she pulled out the photo of her and Danny at about the same age, they could almost pass for James and Claire. Grace's shoulders sagged as a deep sadness flowed through her. She'd never thought about having children. Just like she could never marry. She could also never have children. It wouldn't have been fair to bring them into a world when her past could be discovered at any time, and she could be sent to prison for the rest of her life. Her fate had been sealed the day she went to that bus stop. No use getting sad about it now. What was done was done. Grace pushed it all aside, as she always did, and looked up, giving Lizzie the best smile she could manage. "They're lovely, Lizzie. You must be so proud." Lizzie nodded, her face breaking into a beaming, beautiful smile. "They're such a blessing, Grace, and we love them to bits. Daniel dotes on all 3 of them, but little Claire is Daddy's girl. Isn't that right, Daniel?" Lizzie leaned into Danny and looked up into his eyes as he wrapped his arms around her. "She reminds me of you, love." He kissed the top of Lizzie's head and pulled her close. Grace's eyes moistened. She quickly passed the photos to Brianna and ran her hand over her eyes, hoping nobody noticed. She'd never know the love Danny and Lizzie shared. If only she and Brianna hadn't been sent to live with Aunt Hilda, everything would have been so different. It wasn't fair. Their meals came, and before long they were back in the van heading south to Elam Community Centre. With every mile that passed, Grace became more certain that she and Brianna would be heading home as soon as they arrived. They didn't belong in the Scottish Highlands with a bunch of Christians. Only madness had made her think that this was a good idea.
Secrets and Sacrifice continues in Volume 2, Chapters 11 to 20. Click below to keep listening.